Live from SABC studios in Auckland Park, Johannesburg, welcome to this evening's episode of The Watchdog. My name is Vuyo Mvogo. As President Cyril Ramaphosa observed yesterday in his weekly newsletter, and I quote, "Over the course of time, public servants in our country have come to be in the spotlight for the wrong reasons. We have become too used to stories of civil servants involved in maladministration, embezzlement, corruption and other forms of conduct that betray the values of the public service." Close quote. In a day's time, the Public Service Commission will release a report laying bare some of the challenges facing the state in this regard. As we build up to that, tonight on the show, we explore the private sector's role in corrupting the public sector. But before that conversation, we take some time to remember the 28 South Africans who died at the hands of apartheid-sponsored police of the then Ciskei homeland on this day 29 years ago in what came to be known as the Bisho massacre. The Watchdog starts now.
Braving a cold and rainy weather in honor of their loved ones, this day brings sorrow and heartache to the victims and survivors of the Bisho massacre. They complain that government made a number of promises to them, but nothing has come to fruition.
The worst part that I can say that I felt his absence. It was when my mom couldn't afford for me to go to university.
Some
of the people who died here were breadwinners. I'm also one of them. Some left young children who now live in unfortunate circumstances.
Government has refuted claims that nothing is being done for these families.
The OTP now has set aside an amount of about 200,000 to put the tombstone on these tombs of the families.
A Bisho Massacre Foundation has also been formed in honor of the victims. Abongile Yankees, SABC News, Bisho.
Our first guest tonight is the Premier of the Eastern Cape, whose office has set up what is known as the Bisho Massacre Foundation in the province, amid, of course, the claims you heard there that the government has not done anything for the families. Premier, good evening. Thanks very much for your time. Please unmute yourself. Please unmute yourself, Premier.
Thank you very much. Good evening, Mr. Mvogo, and good evening to the viewers of the Watchdog.
On this day, how do the people of the province of the Eastern Cape remember the 28 people who died?
Well, you would understand that we are one of provinces that have got a couple of these unfortunate events. We've got a couple of massacres that we are always commemorating right across the year in the province. But coming to this one, it's always that day that creates that somberness from people of the province in remembering what happened 29 years ago, where we lost about 28 people on that fateful day. It's a very unfortunate day. It's a day that we always believe that it should have not happened. Unfortunately, it happened. And since we have been remembering this day, we always think about those who laid their lives sacrificing for the freedom that we are all enjoying today. And we all believe that they did that because they wanted to see a country that is moving forward, a country that is united, a country that is non-racial, non-sexist, democratic and prosperous. So we who are actually now in this position of governance, we should always bear in mind that the work that we're doing every day must be the work that seeks to realize those kind of ideals and wishes that those people had. So we continue. We are working with those families. It's not easy. I know there's been some complaints after complaints, but we are now warming up. I know it might have taken a little bit longer, but we do reach out, and we are working now with the foundation. Just to correct one thing, the foundation was not really set up by the Premier's office. We facilitated the establishment of that foundation. This foundation is actually led by the victims themselves and the families of the victims who are supporting them, who are working with them as the office of the Premier. Yes, we are tackling almost every issues that have been there unresolved, support to the families, and how do we look after their livelihood, and making it a point that indeed, because many of those people are breadwinners, as you would know, we are looking at those issues. Government departments across the board are actually working in an integrated way, addressing the issues of housing, where there are challenges of housing, issues of support, and the Department of Justice is actually funding young people who deserve to be in the higher education space. Those bursaries are coming from government. So there's a joint collaborative effort from government to see to it that those families are actually looked after. Yes, we possibly could have done much better in all these years, nothing much. But as I've said, we have so many victims in our province. We talk about Egyptian massacre in Mtanzane. We talk about Langa massacre in Uitenhage. And there are just massacres around the Queenstown massacre because of the role of the province in the struggle for the liberation of our people. So we're looking at all those issues. We've got victims all over. Yes, we are trying to address those issues. That's why we are activating those people, organizing them in the form of this foundation, so that we are able to work with them and support them in the work of trying to change the socio-economic fortunes of their families.
Now, our democracy is 27 years old, you know, one would have thought that some of the problems that the people are raising would actually have been dealt with. Have you been able to put a finger on it as to why we are still talking about, you know, only now beginning to move with speed in addressing the issues that they have raised? Because without that, maybe you may not, you too, you know, will leave, you know, that office not having addressed the challenges, I mean, the issues that these people are raising. So have you been able to put a finger on it, to understand why it is that 27 years down the line, these people are still raising the kinds of issues you seem to suggest are actually or can actually be addressed?
Well, it is in the nature sometimes of how we can do things. As I'm indicating that we are in the province faced with the more challenges like this, and you are not really creating a competition in this kind of challenges that we're dealing with, if you look at all these massacres. But we are trying our level best, and I'm saying it's not that government hasn't been doing anything about this, but we had to improve the integration of making it a point that as government we work together. What is done in that particular corner by another department is also being complemented on the other side by another department. But as government, we have agreed now that we definitely need to improve how we work so that we are able to see that there's progress. If we can give much more details, surely there will be specifics in terms of how many young people would have been assisted in different families, those who would have been supported via Department of Justice going to school. And we've taken a decision to make it a point that Department of Health also provide support and all the medical necessary interventions to those victims that are still feeling some pains because of what they've went through. Yes, of course, as I've indicated, that government has been trying in all these years, and always challenges that we have. But government has done something. The fact that we have got that monument there that you see, which is called the Bisho Massacre Precinct, is part of government trying to do this in recognition. You would understand the struggle for liberation, that even them, they were involved in the struggle to liberate South Africa, not only specifically them and their families for any material interest, but it is in the government way of doing things and our conscience that must make us understand that those families lost breadwinners, and we've got a responsibility as government to make it a point that we address those. So we are trying to make sure that probably things that we would have done much better from 1994, we are still attending to them and reaching out to them. That's why to date we're still working with the families, because they are seeing some strides that government is making, and we are committed to that and making the point that we address all those issues, not only for the Bishop massacre victims, but for all the victims of the massacres that I've spoken about, and we are working with them in those sort of a different setup events. It's unfortunate that we are a province that has participated so hugely in the struggle for liberation, and a lot of sacrifice has been done, and we have lost a lot of people in the process. But we are trying our level best to make sure that we are at least making those families feel better and feel proud for the role that their loved ones played. Okay,
now, but are you among the things that people are asking you to do? Are there demands or requests that you feel the government simply cannot provide them with? Because the reason I'm asking is one gets a sense that people feel they have been strung along. Promises keep on being made but are never fulfilled or delivered on. Have you been honest with them where, as the government, you simply cannot give them some of the things that they're asking for?
Yes, we have been. We've been honest with them, but you would understand sometimes the expectations from people. But we've been honest on what government can do, provided within the actually legal framework on how government can help out. Remember, it's not only them. Almost all Eastern Cape people of South Africans are sacrificed. Some might not have lost loved ones, but you're dealing with a situation which is bigger than them. In the process, you would want to still balance those immediate aspirations from the families like them, and those who also who also took part in the struggle for the liberation, but they still feel like there's nothing that has actually come true for them. So we've been honest with them in telling them what we can do, how we can help them, and I've been actively involved myself as a premier from last year, and the matter is actually more supported from the Office of the Premier, working with the Department of DESREC, to make sure that we really tease out, and we've made it a point that now we're dealing with that kind of ticking the box. What have we done? What we have not done? What were the issues? How we can help them? So we are also helping them within the framework of assisting the people who are destitute. For instance, if one of the family members was a victim, he said, I've been waiting for an RDP house, I couldn't get, but now I'm employed. I'm no longer in need of that RDP house because I can do it myself. So we are dealing with those kind of issues in the broader sense of issues across the socio-economic spectrum. So we have been honest with them, and we've been trying to indicate what we can do. And I can tell you now, there is progress, and we've actually put more effort and support to ensure that they are more organized in the form of that foundation, so that we can be able to assist them and be able to look at those families that are in dire need, dealing with issues of housing, etc., rolling out and making it a point that they are not treated outside the destitute, and we are able to prioritize them. So as government, we are working in a much more consolidated, no longer silo mentality approach at all.
Now, a quick one.
But as I've indicated, many people have participated in the struggle, and there's a lot of expectation from everyone. But as government, we are actually taking into account all such kind of demands. But we have been honest with the families, and they know, and we've been actually frank, and we had robust engagement and discussion with them before.
Very quickly, what is the foundation going to do? And what is that 200,000 that the acting Premier mentioned for? Is it for how this foundation is going to? Is it going towards the administration of the foundation's affairs, or is there something very specific that this foundation needs to do with this 200,000 that the acting Premier spoke about earlier?
No, 200 is just one isolated figure for a specific activity to be done there. We have actually given them an access to that building, as you see. It was part of issues that we're looking at. It's an issue of using that precinct as a tourist destination. And we have said it's them who can tell the story better for tourists who are going through there. We have allocated some offices there for them to operate from, and making it a point that they are part and parcel of what we are trying to do there. The 200 is just an amount, but what we have said, on an annual basis, we'll be able to budget money to do a specific event that will require a particular budget. The 200,000 is about doing something that they requested as foundation to be done there, and it will be done according to those kind of requests that have been made. So it's not really a kind of support that is given to them for the administration. They must run like any other foundations. As you know, that we've got many foundations arising out of all these unfortunate incidents. But we are supporting them with regard to what they are doing, and we are also creating a platform and a space for them to work so that they are also not over-reliant on government, because government is not going to be able to do that and assist them getting that kind of a funding from government as you would have expected. But government will work with them on an activity-based kind of an arrangement. So we are dealing with that. So the 200,000 is just one mention, but I'm saying part of that, we're looking at the issues of tourism activities around that. We've created that. We're supporting young people. We have said young people must be able to operate, be given a space in that building so that they can tell the story better about their parents. Those who are still alive, they can still be there and actually tell the story better to terrorists. So we are working with them on a number of arrangements that are meant to assist them in the process, uplift them, and develop them as well.
Okay, that's where we're going to leave it. Thanks very much for your time this evening. Oscar Mabuyane, who is the Premier of the province of the Eastern Cape. Today, marking 29 years since the massacre that claimed 29 lives and left close to 200 people wounded. The Premier saying they are supporting the Bisho Massacre Foundation, which has been formed in honor of the victims. They're going to be doing activities there. He reckons that the support they're giving them will enable that foundation to do more and more in honor of the victims. Time now to take a quick break. When we return, in anticipation of the report from the Public Service Commission on challenges facing the state, we'll be discussing the private sector's role in corrupting the public sector. Stay with us. Welcome back. This is the Watchdog to discuss the private sector's role in corrupting the public sector, vice versa. We're now joined by Michael Merchant, who is the head of investigations at Open Secret. We're also joined by Melusi Ngala, who is a researcher at Corruption Watch. Good evening, gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. You know, I mean, when one hears the testimonies coming out of the State Capture Commission, inquiry, but also from some of the court cases that have played themselves out in the courts, you begin to see true to that saying, that says it takes two to tango. You see a lot of, the involvement of the private sector in what we have come to see, which many people now describe as the other pandemic or a cancer, whatever you call it. And the complaint from a lot of South Africans is that this issue has not really, we haven't really gotten the nation to focus, on the role of the public sector in making this scourge, the pandemic that many many people are saying it is. Would you share that view, Michael?
Evening, Vuyo. I think I broadly would. I think that there's been largely insufficient attention that's been paid to the role of the private sector in corruption, and in particular kind of grand corruption, state capture. And I think that, you started by raising that saying it takes two to tango. And I think that sometimes the kind of discourse and discussion around corruption is often reduced to a private sector actor just being, the person who pays the bribe or the person who's willing to take advantage of a public sector that is not functioning correctly and that there are no accountability mechanisms. But that's a very small part of the story. And if you look at the State Capture Commission as an example and the stories that have emerged from state capture, what we're rather seeing is that it's much more systemic than that. And it is the very largest corporations in South Africa and around the world that are deeply embedded in corrupt networks. If we look at some of the leading cases or the most prominent cases of state capture, I'm thinking here around the case around Transnet, Eskom or Estina, South African banks and global banks like HSBC were deeply essential for the ability of the Gupta family and other corrupt networks to move money, to hide the proceeds of crime. And we also saw other large private firms, such as audit firms and legal firms, being part of the deals. And in many cases, consultancies actively seeking out contracts with SOEs that they knew were compromised in order to profit therefrom. And that's quite a deep layer of complicity that we've started to peel back, but I don't think enough has been done at the Commission and elsewhere to hold those private sector actors accountable for that conduct.
Melusi, from where you sit?
We strongly believe that there's an intersection between public sector and private sector. And this is the bulk of the corruption that we see occurring, at least in as far as the over 33,000 reports of corruption that we have received since 2012 to date. And, it's not a matter of people just lamenting the fact that, we only often talk about public sector and there's no concentration on private sector, but it's legitimate grounds for those kind of arguments. On the simple basis that, you do find private sector companies doing big business with the government or entities from the state. And we interestingly did a research study which actually looked at 100 companies. We called it Track, in which we actually looked at how some of these companies fared in terms of anti-corruption practices, organizational transparency, and also country-by-country reporting. By that, of course, we're talking about whether they actually are transparent about their profit margins, capital expenditure, and taxes that they pay. And interestingly, all the companies fared quite poorly when it comes to the country-by-country section. And whereas with the anti-corruption programs, in terms of content, they also did poorly. But one of the key questions that we asked in relation to that is whether they make donations to political parties. And there was the answers to that, we couldn't get any clarity from the companies, at least based on public information, because that's what the study was based on what their stance is. Or at least, some of them didn't actually disclose which political parties they were donating to, or they didn't have clear policies on how they should actually donate to political parties. So that's testament to the fact that, we need to look at corruption holistically, both public and private sector.
Very interesting. You say that, and I want to come back to the issue of donations to political parties and how that, has complicated matters over the past 27 years, especially. But I want to start first, perhaps, with the laws, if I may, Michael. We have a raft of laws that are meant to deal with corruption, starting with the Companies Act, itself, which governs how companies are or should be run. But we have others like your Protected Disclosures Act and so on. And interestingly for me, writing in his weekly column last week, President Cyril Ramaphosa said, and I quote, "In South Africa, there is extensive legislative protection for whistleblowers, including through the Protected Disclosures Act, which I've just mentioned, the Labor Relations Act, the Companies Act, Protection Against Harassment Act, and the Constitution itself." So he seems to be convinced that in as far as the laws, of the country, we have more than enough to actually deal, with this problem that we are facing. Would you agree?
I'm going to hedge slightly and say both yes and no. I think that in some regards we have a remarkable legislative framework, and that there's a massive problem with how that framework is implemented and whether people are really held accountable. And so, for example, maybe to give a couple of examples of the laws, the Public Finance Management Act and the Municipal Finance Management Act are very good examples of laws that quite clearly create crimes for those who violate certain provisions of them. And yet, despite the absolutely systemic corruption and mismanagement at the municipal and national levels of government, implicating, again, as Malusi says, both private and public sector, we simply do not see the prosecuting authority and the police pursuing those what should be reasonably simple cases. And I think it's a glaring gap. And I mean, we speak about it in the discourse around corruption often, but there is no getting around the fact that you can have a fantastic legislative framework, but if you don't have the criminal justice agencies and a prosecuting authority that is sufficiently equipped and skilled to take on cases, in the private sector, those are often quite complex cases. It doesn't matter because the law will simply not be enacted. And to go back to the president's column, the whistleblowing protections are a very good example in South Africa, is that it doesn't matter how often we speak about how solid the framework is. The whistleblowers around the country are testament to the fact that they are not functioning. The reality is that corporate whistleblowers do not receive the protection that they're supposed to by law. They're usually iced out and prevented future opportunities. And we've seen very recently that whistleblowers in the public sector are just as likely to be killed before receiving protection from the law. And in that context, there's this vast gap between what we have on paper and what we're seeing in effect.
Malusi, I mean, Corruption Watch has been arguing for years now that these laws need tightening and strengthening.
Yeah, I mean, tightening in as far as actually the law enforcement agencies doing something about corruption, right? So in terms of accountability measures, I mean, it will always be an ongoing measure to look at our laws and revisit and to look at whether there are loopholes. But as Michael has said, currently we do have laws that can, sound laws, at least legislatively, that's supposed to take care of the people, but it's not happening. So, I mean, some might even argue that it's a bit of a false equivalence. But we even have laws about ensuring socioeconomic rights in terms of housing, sanitation, and water, but that's not happening either. So, the question is, how come isn't there accountability? I mean, accountability not only on the top level, but you also see something similar in local municipalities. I raise local municipalities because there too we see a lot of businesses operating like cartel structures, at least according to the data that we have, and they are in cahoots with political figures there as well. And some of these companies have been receiving tenders with hundreds of millions of rands over decades. And, it's the same companies, but they're only paying kickbacks. At the same time, it's to the detriment of the people at community level. So there's no accountability on that level either.
In fact, which reminds me of, and it takes us back to a point you made earlier, or you raised earlier about donations to political parties. We've heard, Malusi, through the state capture, during the state capture inquiry, how the Gavin Watsons of this world operated, how political connections were essential for them, to get billions of rands in tenders, and how they in turn, financed political leaders and their organizations.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is something that is quite prevalent in public discourse, where people are wondering whether we should have full disclosure. I mean, we do have the president did sign it into effect in terms of political party funding disclosure, but there are ways in which, at least based on our data, how we have seen how business persons have an influence on political figures. It doesn't necessarily have to be money that is funneled directly to a political party or directly to a politician, but it goes further than that, right? In some instances, they pay kickbacks to companies or companies that are linked to these politicians or to their friends or relatives, and then eventually that money gets funneled back to those politicians. So there are sophisticated schemes at play, and we need to be able to look at all of these systemic problems and not just saying, okay, is party X or party Y getting so much money from this particular individual, because there are ways to circumvent those laws, at least criminal ways.
And Michael, I mean, this is not something that started a few years ago or during the so-called 9 wasted years. I mean, we all remember the Brett Cables, of this world, who were encircled by the young lions of the ANC Youth League.
Absolutely. And I would argue, and Open Secrets certainly argues, that it goes back even further than that.
In fact, you guys have done incredible work in that regard, yes.
Yeah, and I think that what we've said in the past is that the late apartheid state was fundamentally criminalized, not just because it was a criminal state, the crime of apartheid, but that state became increasingly desperate to survive in its later years, and we saw both globalized corruption in terms of the money flows to allow the apartheid state to buy weapons, but we also saw increasing graft and corruption internally, including the use of suspicious party funding. And that, I think, bled over into the early democratic state precisely because we didn't have any proper reckoning for the corruption of that era. And then what we see very soon after the democratic transition is the 1999 arms deal, another massive corruption scandal that includes global corporations and the arms companies, but also includes likely a very large party funding element, because it's almost certain that the ANC would have received funding from that. And if we draw that line between the corrupt arms trade of the 1980s to the 99 arms deal and the way that criminal justice agencies were subsequent to the arms deal attacked by those private and public actors in order to prevent themselves from ever being held accountable, we start to see that trajectory and that line all the way from there to the challenges that we face today. And as we try and we're trying to rebuild those structures, but their decimation comes from a very long story of corruption, which, to go back to what Malusi said, fundamentally captures the intersection of the public and private, and the idea that we can't look at them separately.
And Malusi, I mean, what's also ironic here is that, at times you realize that, procurement policies that are meant to address, apartheid's legacy end up being used essentially to legitimize these corrupt activities.
Yeah, interestingly, yeah. I mean, what we've done, well, we're actually currently doing work looking at procurement, and part of that work is to actually say that, if companies have been found to be part of dodgy dealings, or at least have been found guilty of some form of malfeasance, especially working with the public sector or getting some contract from government, be it on municipal or provincial or national level, then those parties should be blacklisted, or at least the public should get to know about them, especially if they're ought to bid, because the bidding process is something that needs to be done transparently, not only in terms of the tenders, not only in terms of people getting to know about which tenders and what criteria there are, but also in terms of scrutinizing the companies, because some of these companies, they do make use of these loopholes that exist in legislation to say that, okay, how can we best benefit from these current laws?
Michael, there's something people often say, perhaps glibly, lamenting how the new guys, in this instance, talking about the new government that took over in 1994, how some within the governing party or those who, were very influential, quickly learned, the tricks of, the old apartheid operatives, and they are now just rolling, that out and actually, employing these tricks very well. And I know, your organization has done a lot of work in looking at what happened, especially during the dying days of apartheid. Is that, in fact, true?
I certainly think that it is. And I think that the problem we have is that, and state capture is maybe a very good example of this, contemporary example for people to look at, is that it is fundamentally a very network-based system. And so there's vast networks of criminality that become embroiled in extractive and corrupt practices. And that was exactly the case towards the end of the apartheid regime, is that you had domestic and global networks that were all benefiting from the corruption that was happening and the type of extraction from the South African state. But the problem with those networks is that they will survive if you do not dismantle them. And the only way to dismantle them is with full and effective accountability. And that is something that we have never seen. We've never seen full and proper accountability for the crimes of apartheid, both physical and economic. And one of the great problems of that is that without then breaking those networks by holding people accountable, they survive and they draw in new actors. I think it's very unfortunate how easy that proved to be and how many people have plugged into a system of extraction at the expense of essentially their constitutional duties. But it's also a lesson for us now, is that if we're going to move past state capture, there has to be proper accountability. The Zondo report is coming out soon, but that needs to be the beginning of much more wide-ranging action, criminal accountability, the recovery of funds, in order to disrupt and ensure that the practices aren't being repeated immediately thereafter.
And Malusi, it's true what Michael's saying, isn't it? On accountability, we can, yes, and we should point out talk about the role of the private sector in corruption, in corrupting those in the public sector. But that's no excuse for not exercising accountability. It reminds me of a few days ago, the CEO of ESCOM, was talking on our radio, one of our radio stations, about how he got to discover how those knee protectors had been purchased at 80,000 rands a piece, when in the local hardware store a pair costs you 180. You can't blame the the private sector, for that, even though this one, particular one was actually called to account. But people have to be accountable.
People do have to be accountable, but the emphasis is what Mike says, right? That there's a network of corruption and it goes far. So we need to also look at how do we implement accountability? Do we just implement accountability for show, or do we actually want effective and real results? Because when we think about corruption, we shouldn't just narrow it to what's happening today or what happened in the last 20-odd years of this new dispensation or even apartheid. We should think about it in terms of the colonial state itself was premised on corruption. From someone like Jan van Riebeeck coming to South Africa as someone who was an outlaw, at least a criminal from where he originally came from. And, he was allowed to operate in this particular environment based on that. And he was doing corrupt dealing. So accountability is something that needs to be looked at, yes, on holding specific individuals accountable, but also dismantling the system in terms of who and what it serves, because it will continue. The mere fact that we have evergreen contracts, for example, for some companies, that in itself is also a problem. We need to look at what are the underlying reasons for that. How come is that allowed to persist?
Michael, how effective has been naming and shaming in countries or jurisdictions where at least some very real progress has actually been made, in stemming corruption, especially from private sector players?
Naming and shaming has some value, and I think in particular there's a power in it in terms of a mass response, and potentially in some markets a consumer response that can really pressure companies, pressure them by affecting the bottom line. But I don't think that it replaces the need for kind of genuine accountability. And I think what we've seen in places like particularly the United States and in many countries in Europe is that you've got many systems whereby companies are routinely identified, shamed, entered into what is often a deferred prosecution, and then they pay over a lot of money, but it doesn't necessarily stop the practice. If we look at HSBC as a global bank is a good example of this. HSBC has been found out, named, shamed, and fined for money laundering practices routinely, year after year, for some of the biggest scandals in the world of banking. And yet it now emerges from our very own State Capture Commission that it was laundering the proceeds of corruption at Transnet, and it was laundering them as part of a larger laundry network that included terrorism financing. And I think that that's the lesson, that particularly for the more egregious offenders, it has to take more than naming and shaming.
So what else? What else does it take? Learning from those who may have done it better than us at this point. Michael?
When it comes to cases of those large corporations, in terms of particularly money laundering, but also the large audit firms and legal firms, I think the sad reality is that we certainly struggle to find a gold standard of what works, because I think we find that we have many problems in that regard. So very often there is some form of accountability, such as fines and other processes, but it doesn't necessarily stop the conduct. What we think would be an important step in this regard is looking at where we can hold corporate executives accountable. And Vuyo, you early on spoke about laws such as the Companies Act and various other legislative frameworks in South Africa. It's identifying when an executive or a leader of a corporation can be shown to have had knowledge and still partaken in something, that we pursue those individuals. Because I do think that there is significant deterrent effect not only in the corporation that needs to be held to account, but also for individual criminal and civil liability of directors and other people who have been involved.
Melusi, you spoke earlier about sophisticated schemes, as you call them, and Michael earlier was talking about the role of the police and the rest, the NPA and the rest of your law enforcement agencies. Do you think that over time those law enforcement agencies have sort of gained the kind of knowledge, expertise that are needed to deal with those sophisticated schemes?
Yeah, can I just backtrack a little bit? I want to say that as much as, yes, I agree wholeheartedly with what Michael says about naming and shaming, but we also need to appreciate what naming and shaming has done for the South African context, right? It has served as awareness, it has served as public education in some instances where we could mobilize members of the public to actually take issues of corruption seriously. When we think about it, corruption wasn't necessarily something that was discussed much in the 90s or early 2000s, but all of a sudden now it is a buzzword and everybody wants to understand and everybody laments it. So that's the work of naming and shaming. Now it's just a question of how do we as members of the public take it further and holding those who are in power accountable. So in other words, what do we do with our vote? But also, but to answer more directly your question, I feel that, in some respects, yes, people make arguments that our police services or law enforcement do not have enough resources. But definitely, I mean, the personnel is available to actually do something about the kind of corruption that we see. But the problem is that it's always often rooted in factional battles, and it's always within the ANC. So it's about who ANC factions want to be held accountable. And the longer that still is allowed to continue, the more we will see or have these kind of discussions where, questioning whether law enforcement is really interested in serving the country. And, when you talk about institutions such as the Hawks or even the SIU or even the NPA and also commercial crimes within SABC, they definitely have means and capabilities to actually take care of some of these economic crimes and corruption. But it's just a question of whether there is the will to do so based on who's in power.
Michael, your sense of whether our state law enforcement agencies are up to the task, given the complexities sometimes, or the ability, especially of the big players, to actually evade even detection, let alone being put in jail or fined or anything like that?
I definitely think that for the more sophisticated and global scandals that involve massive money flows, that I would be slightly concerned that there is some skills gap within the Hawks and the MPA. And I would say that a lot of that is driven by an exodus of very skilled people over many years because of what's happened in those institutions. And I do think that that's a concern. However, I think that Malusi's point is arguably the more important one, which is that we need to look at who remains within those institutions and what they've been implicated in for many years. We still have prosecutors that are very powerful within the MPA who have been implicated in very serious allegations linked to state capture and linked to failures predating that. We have prosecutors who have consistently failed, for example, to prosecute apartheid crimes despite recommendations from the TRC. We have prosecutors who quite clearly trumped up charges against people on behalf of political principles, as Malusi says. And I think what we tend to forget is that those people are still deeply entrenched in those institutions. And that's across the board, the police, the Hawks, and the MPA. And so it's very difficult, I think, with an institution where you may well have many skilled people and also many people who want to get things done. But if there are very serious bottlenecks within the institutions holding up accountability, that's a massive problem. And I think it needs to be a priority area of concern, is to focus in on those people. And where there are serious allegations, to ask the question, what needs to be done? But is there a disciplinary process? Why is the person not being removed?
Malusi, as we close, just your thoughts on how we can continue to, or perhaps do more than we have done. In the same way, we shone the light on, what happened, whether it was your Gupta families and everyone else who was involved. It took a lot of effort from so many people, some people, sacrificing, paying the price. Being kicked out of their jobs, others being killed, as that continues to be the case even now. How do we put a more, concerted effort in ensuring that we really do shine the light on the private sector's role in this corruption pandemic?
I think, we as a collective, we need to tell the stories of private sector corruption. We need to tell the stories of fraud. We need to tell the stories, for example, where companies in relation to the temporary employment relief scheme that they currently have. For example, there are companies that are deliberately defrauding the state. So those companies we need to know more about them, and we need to call for accountability. But beyond that, I think to a point that Michael made earlier on, we need to hold individuals responsible when it comes to companies, and not just the company as a collective, because some of these companies even budget for corruption to say that, okay, if we do this, it's probably going to cost us X amount, so we need to prepare for that fine. So we need to bear that in mind and say, okay, how do we innovatively actually prosecute specific executives to say we hold them accountable. But lastly, I want to make the point that we're citizens, we shouldn't just be passive participants in this entire process. We need to acknowledge that we do have a leadership crisis in society. You know, we need to think of, you know, do our leaders are our leaders ethical? Do they have integrity? Do they also have a social conscience? And if we find that they don't, then maybe it's high time to actually really vote them out and actually put in people that we think are more than capable to serve us, because those people do exist. They don't have to be politicians, especially in relation to local municipalities, for example. You know, those can be people like you, Vuyo, Michael, myself, perhaps, you know, or the viewers out there who actually know that, you know what, this person has the best interest of our society, because we cannot continue this way. At this rate, you know, we'll still be talking corruption in 5, 10 years, 20 years' time. Quick last word from you, Michael.
I would just echo what Malusi said, that it's got to be a dual purpose. It's got to be a dual project of accountability and getting our institutions back up and running and functioning effectively, but also that it's a much more society-wide thing. And state capture was not just systemic corruption and what that cost, but it was also, I think, a fundamental attack on democracy, and the fact that our institutions and powerful corporations were conducting themselves completely at odds with the interests of all South African people. And we've seen that profiteering continue through the pandemic. And it's going to require a society-wide response to push back against that.
And that's where we're going to leave it. Thanks to both of you gentlemen, Michael Merchant, who is the head of investigations at Open Secret, as well as Melusi Ngala, who is a researcher at Corruption Watch. That's where we're going to leave it this evening. Do join us again tomorrow evening, same time. Have a good night.